After the end of the Great War, Europe lay transformed, forever. But it also had unforeseen and far-reaching consequences. The growing nationalism in different parts of the world brought about a growing desire for sovereignty. In India, nationalism ramped up after the Sepoy Rebellion of the mid-1800s and the British response, which you can check out in our previous episode. Like in Europe, nationalists in British India were often of the educated middle classes and preferred reform to outright revolution. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, or Lokmanya, was one of the first advocates for Swaraj, or self-rule, a more decentralized and communal rule by Indians. British colonial authorities dubbed him the father of Indian unrest. Gopal Krishna Gokhale was another leader, although more moderate, attempting reform by working within the existing government structure. As the British were unwilling to provide anything more than superficial change, a group of Indian nationalists met in Bombay and formed the Indian National Congress, or INC. These were mainly high-caste Indians, educated in the Western style. While they did agree with many of Britain's policies against some of India's traditional practices, they also fought for more governance and economic power for all Indians, regardless of religion or economic status. In 1905, the British Viceroy, Lord Curzon, partitioned the Muslim-majority Bengal region for administrative purposes, but also to effectively divide and weaken the nationalist movement on religious grounds. The partition sparked widespread protests and marked the beginning of the Swadeshi movement, which advocated for the boycott of British goods and the promotion of Indian-made products. Handloom weaving, spinning, and other traditional crafts were revived. As most INC leaders were Hindu, the All India Muslim League was established in 1906 to represent the interests of the Muslim population. By 1907, the INC had only garnered small concessions from the British and generally wanted more governance within the British Empire, but a more radical extremist group split from the INC moderates, wanting to expel the British completely. The movement was a success, and the partition was eventually repealed in 1911. A few years later, a lawyer returned to India, after living in South Africa since 1893. His name was Mohandas Gandhi, and he quickly became a leading figure in the INC. After studying in London, Gandhi faced discrimination in South Africa, famously being thrown off a train for refusing to move from a first-class compartment reserved for whites. This incident was a turning point in his life, making him aware of the racial injustices faced by Indians. He founded the Natal Indian Congress to fight discrimination against the Indian community. At this time, his activism initially focused on improving the status of Indians, often to the exclusion of black Africans. It was there that Gandhi developed and refined the concept of satyagraha, or truth force, which advocated for non-violent resistance to injustice. This philosophy became the cornerstone of his later work with the INC. He implemented the satyagraha as a rallying call to unite Hindus and Muslims against the British, supporting their own anti-British movements. He believed the British didn't have the numbers to rule by force and that they only succeeded thus far through cooperation. By the end of the year, Britain passed the 1919 Government of India Act, in response to growing nationalist demands and India's significant contributions during World War I. The reform benefited millions of Indians, but it also pushed many members of the INC to become more friendly to the idea of full independence. In the perceived threat from nationalists, the British implemented the Rowlatt Act, emergency measures which allowed indefinite detainment and imprisonment without trial. Protests against the act were most prominent in the Punjab, which resulted in the massacre of over 1,500 non-violent protesters at the hands of the British India Army. Gandhi launched his next movement in 1920, the non-cooperation movement, encouraging Indians to withdraw from British institutions, return honours and titles, and boycott British goods. In resistance to British textile imports, he began making his own simple clothing with the spinning wheel. The spinning wheel became a symbol of resistance and brought women to the forefront. The movement saw widespread participation, but a violent incident unfolded in 1922 at Chori Chora, where protesters retaliated against policemen, killing around 23 of them and 3 civilians. Due to the violence, the movement was soon called off by Gandhi. In 1927, the British government appointed the Simon Commission to report on the political situation, but it faced significant opposition as it had no Indian members. The slogan "Simon Go Back" became popular during protests against the commission. In 1930, in response to the raising of the salt tax and prohibition of Indians collecting their own salt, Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement, with the famous Salt March to Dandi, on the Arabian Sea, where he broke the British laws by making salt from seawater. Gandhi was arrested once again. The movement saw widespread participation and civil disobedience, including non-payment of taxes and boycott of British goods. The Dalits, or untouchables, he coined as Harijans, children of God. He campaigned to improve their conditions in 1933, and was arrested yet again. In total, Gandhi was arrested at least 7 times since he returned, not including his run-ins with the authorities in South Africa. By the 1930s, a newer face would emerge in the INC. This was Jawaharlal Nehru, son of a prominent leader of the National Congress. Under his father, Motilal, the INC issued the Nehru Report, an attempt by Indian leaders to draft a constitution for India as a dominion within the British Commonwealth, offering it more independence while still remaining within the empire. But the report was rejected by the Muslim League and other groups, highlighting the growing divide between different sections of Indian society. Jawaharlal envisioned a new phase, where independence would be based on both Western and Indian values, a merging of tradition and religion, with progressivism and secularism. Over time, the Muslim League became less represented, and they advocated for a separate Muslim nation to be formed, called the Land of the Pure, or Pakistan. But it would be over a decade still before this came to pass, while tensions remained high. The Middle East remained more complicated. The Ottomans had gone through the 1800s in a state of decline. They attempted to modernize through the Tanzimat, or reorganization, a period of extensive reforms implemented from 1839. But the Ottomans were also struck by nationalist movements from the diverse groups within their empire. To lessen the nationalist fervor, the Ottomans promoted the idea that all subjects of the empire, regardless of ethnicity or religion, should have equal rights and responsibilities, a political ideology called Ottomanism. It encouraged the notion of a common Ottoman citizenship to replace the traditional millet system, which categorized people by religion. Despite its inclusive ideals, Ottomanism faced significant challenges from nationalist movements within various ethnic groups, such as the Greeks, Serbs, Armenians, and Arabs, who sought independence or greater autonomy. In 1876, the Young Ottomans, a secret society of intellectuals and writers, wanted more aggressive reform than the Tanzimat. They overthrew the Sultan and pushed through the first constitution, making the Ottoman Empire a constitutional monarchy with a legislative assembly. Abdülhamid was made Sultan, but after just 2 years, he suspended parliament and re-established authoritarian rule. This lasted until the early 1900s, until a more radical group called the Committee of Union and Progress, a faction of a newer reformist group called the Young Turks, took power. The Young Turks started off as a more modern pan-Ottoman movement like the Young Ottomans, but eventually became less concerned with religion as a unifying factor and began favoring Turkish nationalism. With heavy support from military officers, they forced the Sultan to restore the constitution in what became known as the Young Turk Revolution. A string of assassinations forced Abdülhamid to abdicate by 1909, and his brother, Mehmed V, took the throne as monarch. Through the political instability, rebellions sprang up, and those in the Balkans fought for their independence. With the territorial decline of the empire, the Young Turks began to view themselves in more nationalistic terms as well, and strove for a state in Anatolia for ethnic Turks. The final nail in the coffin for the empire came with World War I. As discussed last episode, the Ottomans had joined the Central Powers and were besieged by Allied forces during a series of 3 campaigns in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and Sinai and Palestine. During the latter, British intelligence officer T.E. Lawrence, who came to be known as Lawrence of Arabia, encouraged Arab nationalist sentiment against the Ottomans, leading to the Arab Revolt. In 1916, the Kingdom of Hejaz declared independence, allying with the British against the Ottomans, with the promise for a unified Arab state after the war. The Ottomans couldn't handle the Allied offensives, and by the end of the war, the once mighty empire was minimized to the Anatolian Peninsula. Once the war ended, the Ottoman Empire's former territories in the Middle East were occupied and planned to be redistributed among the Allied powers. Greek forces occupied Izmir in 1919, sparking outrage and galvanized Turkish spirit once again. This was represented by war hero Mustafa Kemal. Kemal commanded the Ottoman forces that repelled the Allied invasion during the Gallipoli campaign, which we went over last episode. He later left the Ottoman army, and now, Turkish nationalists banded behind him in a war of independence to create a new state. He spent the summer amassing support and uniting various nationalist groups opposed to the occupation and Ottoman compliance. Mustafa Kemal established the Grand National Assembly in Ankara as a rival government to the Ottoman Sultanate in Istanbul. This assembly took over the leadership of the independence movement. In summer 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres confirmed the disintegration of the empire, with provisions for the mandate system. It planned to partition the empire among the Allied powers, granting significant portions of its territory to Greece, Italy, France, and Britain, and recognizing Armenia and Kurdistan as independent regions. But Mustafa Kemal stripped the signatories of authority and went to war. Turkish forces resisted French and Armenian advances in the south. By early 1921, agreements were reached, and French forces withdrew from Cilicia. In the east, the Treaty of Alexandropol and the Treaty of Kars settled conflicts with Armenia and secured Turkey's eastern borders. The war to the west with the Greeks was of most consequence. Under İsmet İnönü, Turkish forces repelled Greek advances at the battles of İnönü in January and March 1921. While Turkish forces under Mustafa Kemal's command halted the Greek advance at the Battle of Sakarya that summer. The final and decisive offensive by Turkish forces culminated in the recapture of Izmir on September 9, 1922, securing the peninsula. The Grand National Assembly abolished the Ottoman Sultanate soon after, ending centuries of Ottoman rule. In July 1923, the Allies had to renegotiate and signed the Treaty of Lausanne, recognizing the sovereignty of the new Turkish state and establishing its modern borders. At the end of October, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was declared the first president of the Republic of Turkey, marking the official establishment of the new Turkish state, a secular republic. Mustafa Kemal, now known as Atatürk, or Father Turk, implemented a set of reforms based on European models. A strong sense of Turkish nationalism was promoted through education, language reform, and cultural initiatives. The old Ottoman titles of nobility, like Bey or Pasha, were abolished, and citizens were required to choose hereditary surnames. The hat law required the abandonment of the traditional fez in favor of Western-style hats, symbolizing a break from the Ottoman past. Arabic script, used for writing Turkish, was replaced with a modified Latin alphabet, making literacy more accessible and aligning Turkey more closely with the West. The state established and operated various enterprises in key sectors such as transportation, banking, and manufacturing to drive economic development. Efforts were made to industrialize the country through the establishment of factories, infrastructure projects, and the promotion of local industries. Land reforms aimed to modernize agriculture, redistribute land, and improve productivity. Secularism was a cornerstone of Ataturk's reforms, ensuring the separation of religion from state affairs and promoting a secular national identity. The succession of the Caliphate, dating back to Muhammad, which the Ottomans had claimed from the Abbasids in the 1500s, was abolished. Law was based on the Swiss Civil Code, which replaced the Islamic Sharia law, modernizing family law and granting women equal rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Women were granted the right to vote and stand for election in 1934, and reforms were introduced to promote gender equality in education and the workforce. Religious influence on public life was minimized, with measures such as the closure of religious courts and dervish lodges, and the prohibition of religious attire in public institutions. By Ataturk's death in 1938, the Ottoman Empire had been replaced by the new, modern Turkish nation. Just to the east was Iran, a nation that stayed neutral during the Great War. Since 1789, it continued to be ruled by the Qajar dynasty, who established their capital at Tehran, in a more easily defended mountainous region. Throughout the 19th century, Iran suffered significant territorial losses to Russia in the Caucasus region. The Qajar rulers later faced increasing interference from the British, who sought to extend their influence in Iran as part of the Great Game. By the early 1900s, growing dissatisfaction with corruption and foreign influence led to the Constitutional Revolution. Intellectuals, merchants, and clerics demanded reform, and in 1906, the Qajar Shah was forced to accept a constitution, leading to the establishment of the Majlis, or parliament, and a constitutional monarchy. But the discovery of oil reserves further strengthened foreign presence, with profits being siphoned to British investors. Iran declared neutrality during World War I, but the country became a battleground for Ottoman, Russian, and British forces, causing significant social and economic disruption. In 1921, Reza Khan, a military officer, led a coup against the weak Qajar government, and by 1925, he had consolidated power and was crowned Reza Shah, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah quickly implemented a series of modernization and secularization reforms, including the development of infrastructure, centralization of government authority, and the reduction of clerical power. He introduced Western-style legal codes, changed the traditional dress code, and encouraged the adoption of Western customs and education. In 1935, he formally had the name of the nation changed from Persia, requesting all foreign delegates to refer to it as Iran. Though formerly a constitutional monarchy, Reza Shah's rule ended up being an authoritarian military dictatorship as he bypassed parliament and suppressed political dissent and ethnic minorities. Over to the west, in the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia had been under Ottoman rule since the 1600s, divided into three main provinces: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. The region was ethnically and religiously diverse, including Arabs, Assyrians, and Kurds in the northern mountains. By the end of the war, British forces had occupied most of the region, ending centuries of Ottoman control. When the League of Nations established the mandate system to administer former Ottoman territories, they allocated the mandate of Mesopotamia to Britain. But widespread dissatisfaction with British rule led to the Iraqi Revolt of 1920, involving various tribes and communities. The revolt was suppressed by British forces, but it highlighted the need for changes in governance, and the mandate for Mesopotamia was scrapped in favor of the creation of the Kingdom of Iraq, which still remained heavily under British influence. To gain local support and stabilize the region, the British installed Faisal ibn Hussein as the King of Iraq in 1921. The British and the new Iraqi government signed the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty in 1922, establishing a constitutional monarchy under Faisal and outlining the terms of British influence and military presence in the new Iraqi kingdom. But throughout the 1920s, nationalist sentiments continued to grow among Iraqis, demanding full independence from British control. Further negotiations led to new agreements in 1926 and 1927, progressively reducing British control and paving the way for independence. 1932 was momentous, as on October 3, Iraq was officially granted independence and admitted to the League of Nations, ending the British Mandate. This marked the establishment of the Kingdom of Iraq as a fully sovereign state under King Faisal I. Faisal had been part of the House of Hashemite and had been instrumental in the Arab Revolt during World War I, but there had been major anti-imperial movements dating back to the 1700s, especially in the rolling sands of Arabia. The Ottomans had nominal control of the Arabian Peninsula, but struggled to maintain control over the interior, which was still governed by different Arab societies. The most prominent of these was led by the House of Saud, established in the 18th century by Muhammad bin Saud. This would become the royal family that would form Saudi Arabia. The first Saudi state was founded in 1744 in alliance with the religious leader Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. He advocated for a puritanical form of Islam, now known as Wahhabism. It called for a return to the pure and original practices of Islam, rejecting what was seen as corruptions and innovations. This state was centered in Diriyah, but it grew too large and alarmed the Ottomans once the holy cities of Mecca and Medina were captured. Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II ordered Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt to suppress the Saudi rebellion and restore Ottoman control, and by 1818, the first Saudi state was dissolved. But not even a decade later, the House of Saud re-established control in 1824, forming the second Saudi state with Riyadh as its capital. This state, called the Emirate of Nejd, was far weaker and never captured the Hijaz region. It struggled from internal conflicts and rival tribes, leading to civil war, and its collapse in 1891. In 1902, Abdulaziz ibn Saud began his own campaign over the next 3 decades to unify the Arabian Peninsula. He started by recapturing Riyadh while annexing the rich oasis of Al-Hassa from the Ottomans by 1913. During World War I, Ibn Saud remained neutral in the Hashemite-led Arab Revolt. As they consolidated power, they crushed the Hayl, former vassals who brought about the end of the Second Saudi state in 1891. By 1921, this gave Ibn Saud control over the central area as well, called the Nejd. By late 1925, he had conquered the Kingdom of Hijaz, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina from the Hashemites, giving him hegemony over the majority of the peninsula. In September 1932, Ibn Saud unified the Kingdom of Nejd and the Kingdom of Hijaz into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the culmination of the third and longest-lasting Saudi state. The alliance between the House of Saud and the Wahhabi religious establishment continued to be a central aspect of Saudi governance, and Wahhabism was established as the dominant form of Islam in the kingdom, influencing both religious and political life. Ibn Saud centralized power, established a national government, and began to modernize the administrative structure of the country. Saudi Arabia's early economy was primarily based on agriculture, trade, and pilgrimage revenues to Mecca and Medina. But everything changed in 1938. After a year of drilling, Dammam No. 7 struck oil in March, marking the beginning of Saudi Arabia's transformation into a global economic power. North of the Arabian Peninsula was mandated to the French the mandates of Syria and Lebanon, which were subsequently divided up based on demographics. But of more consequence, though, was the region of the southern Levant, the land of Palestine. By the late 19th century, the weakening of the Ottoman Empire and rising nationalism led to increased European interest in the region. This took form in the rise of the Zionist movement, which sought to establish a Jewish homeland in Zion, or Jerusalem. Initial Zionist movements were spiritual or cultural in nature, encouraging Jews to settle agricultural communities in Palestine as a precursor to the coming of the Messiah. The Lovers of Zion was a movement that emerged in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, largely in response to pogroms and anti-Semitic violence, particularly in the Russian Empire. Lovers of Zion played a significant role in the first Aliyah, the first major wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine from 1881 to 1903. By the turn of the century, Theodor Herzl, a Jewish Austro-Hungarian journalist, organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. This Congress marked the formal launch of the Zionist movement and established the World Zionist Organization to coordinate efforts towards creating a Jewish state. Unlike earlier forms of Zionism that were more culturally or religiously oriented, Herzl's vision was explicitly political. He aimed to achieve the establishment of a Jewish state through diplomatic and political means, recognizing the need for negotiation, and was open to solutions in the interim. For example, he explored the possibility of establishing a temporary refuge for Jews in other regions, such as Uganda, still controlled by the British, and even Argentina, which was vast, with fertile land and a relatively small population. But these proposals were ultimately rejected by the majority of the Zionist movement. After the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, the Second Aliyah brought thousands more Jews to Palestine between 1904 and 1914. This wave saw the rise of a more left-wing form of Zionism, which emphasized the importance of Jewish labor and the establishment of a socialist society in Palestine, creating agricultural settlements like kibbutzim and moshevim. In 1917, a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, expressed the British government's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This Balfour Declaration was seen as a significant victory for the Zionist movement, providing political legitimacy and encouragement for Jewish immigration to Palestine. Britain would be able to facilitate more immigration, as they soon were mandated to the region after the war. Following the declaration, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, particularly during the Third Aliyah from 1919 to 1923, and Fourth Aliyah from 1924 to 1928. But there was one major problem. During World War I, the British had made various promises to Arab leaders to gain their support against the Ottoman Empire, promising the Hashemite king of Hijaz an independent Arab state, but the exact region was deliberately left ambiguous. It was interpreted by the Arabs to include most of the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, from Aleppo in the north to Aden in the south. But the British reneged on their promise and signed a secret treaty with France to divide up these former Ottoman lands between themselves. These borders were slightly changed and finalized after the Mandate system and Turkish War of Independence, but they became the basis for the modern Middle East. Mandatory Palestine was a strategic geopolitical location, as it was between the Suez Canal and the oil-rich areas of the Middle East, and it also allowed them to support and facilitate Jewish immigration. At the end of the war, the British attempted to rectify the situation with the Hashemites by supporting Hussein's rule in the Hijaz and the establishment of his sons as rulers in newly created states, with Iraq under Faisal and the creation of Transjordan under the leadership of Abdullah. The Arab population in Palestine opposed the Balfour Declaration, fearing that the establishment of a Jewish national home would lead to their displacement and loss of political control. The result was increased tension between Jews and Arabs, protests and violent clashes. The first major outbreak of violence occurred during the Nebi Musa festival in 1920 in Jerusalem. Further violence erupted in Jaffa in 1921, after a confrontation between two rival Jewish socialist groups was joined by the local Arab population. Arab leaders and communities organized to oppose the Balfour Declaration and Jewish immigration. The Arab Higher Committee, under prominent leaders like Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini, emerged as a political force advocating for Arab rights. The Zionist movement organized through the Jewish Agency, which coordinated immigration, land purchases, and settlement activities, lobbying the British government and international community. But the broader promise of an independent and unified Arab state was not honored, leading to lasting tensions and disputes in the region. Nearby, the Khedivate of Egypt had been occupied by the British from 1882, although it remained nominally under Ottoman sovereignty. During this period, the British focused on modernizing Egypt's infrastructure, particularly the Suez Canal, often at the benefit of British interests more than the local population. As the occupation and rise of violent incidents increased, there was a rise in Egyptian nationalist movements demanding greater autonomy and independence from British control. Egypt's strategic importance increased during World War I. The British declared martial law and imposed conscription, leading to increased resentment among Egyptians. Abbas II, Khedive of Egypt, became closer with the Ottomans and instead supported the Central Powers. But while out of the country, he was deposed by the British and they abolished the Khedivate, proclaiming the Sultanate of Egypt, fully severing ties to the Ottomans. After the war, many Egyptians believed that the British protectorate was just a temporary wartime measure and that Egypt would be fully independent afterwards. But despite Egyptian contributions to the Allies and the destabilization it caused, this wasn't the case. Saad Zaghloul emerged as a prominent nationalist leader and head of the Wafd Party, which became the main political force advocating for complete independence and parliamentary democracy. The British ordered his exile, but this resulted in the nationwide 1919 Egyptian Revolution. Though the British suppressed it, it was costly, and negotiations began. In 1922, Britain unilaterally recognized Egypt's independence. Britain still retained control over key areas such as defense, foreign affairs, Sudan to the south, and the protection of foreign interests and minorities. Egypt's Sultan became King Fuad I of the new Kingdom of Egypt. A new constitution was promulgated in 1923, establishing a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system. It aimed to balance the powers of the king and the elected parliament. The Wafd Party won a majority in the 1924 parliamentary elections, and Zaghloul became prime minister. But tensions between the Wafd and the monarchy, as well as British interference, led to political instability. In 1924, Salih Stack, the British Governor-General of Sudan and commander of the Egyptian army, was assassinated by Egyptian nationalists. This led to a British ultimatum and the resignation of Zaghloul as Prime Minister. Zaghloul died soon after, leaving a power vacuum, one which would become filled in the following decades. In 1928, in the Suez Canal zone, a school teacher and Islamic scholar, Hassan al-Banna, founded what would become known as the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood aimed to revive Islamic teachings and implement Sharia as the basis for personal conduct and societal governance. The Brotherhood focused on establishing schools, mosques, hospitals, and welfare services to address social issues and promote Islamic values. While initially avoiding direct political involvement, the Brotherhood gradually became more politically active, advocating for the end of British colonial rule and the establishment of an Islamic state. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, it had established branches throughout the Middle East. King Farouk, 10th king of the Muhammad Ali dynasty, succeeded his father in 1936 and oversaw the implementation of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, negotiated earlier to resolve some of the issues of British control. It provided for the withdrawal of British troops from most of Egypt, except the Suez Canal zone, and acknowledged Egypt's sovereignty while maintaining British influence in defense and foreign affairs. It was a step towards full independence, but it would take decades more to come to fruition. Alongside nationalism, another ideology was slowly spreading, that of Marxism. Initially, its spread outside of Europe was sluggish, as it didn't yet resonate with agrarian workers or those under colonial rule. But after the formal establishment of the first socialist state in 1917, Lenin altered and expanded Marxist theory. In 1920, after the failure of revolution in Europe, Lenin began to target non-Western regions of the world, aligning with the new anti-imperial movements taking shape. Lenin devised a strategy to ally with the lower classes and unite with the middle classes and bourgeoisie in order to first get rid of the imperialist powers and create their own national liberal democracy. Only then would the working class be in a position for proletarian revolution against the bourgeoisie. To spread his ideology to the working classes outside of Europe, he used agents of the Communist International, or Comintern. Its primary goal was to promote and support a global revolution and to coordinate the activities of communist parties worldwide. The Comintern supported anti-colonial movements and liberation struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By the mid-1920s, most Asian states had a Marxist party. The one that would become the most consequential was in the Far East. We had last left China after the fall of the Qing and birth of the Republic. The Republic of China was officially established, with Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general, succeeding Sun Yat-sen as president in 1912. Despite the establishment of the Republic, China still remained fragmented. Yuan Shikai and his Beiyang government attempted to consolidate power, and in 1915, he declared himself emperor, signaling a rebirth of the Chinese Empire. But his actions led to widespread opposition. Sun Yat-sen's party, now called the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, launched a second revolution in 1913, but it was poorly planned and failed, with many of its leaders, including Sun Yat-sen, fleeing to Japan. Following Yuan's death in 1916, China entered a period of political fragmentation and chaos known as the Warlord era. Officers in his Beiyang army and regional warlords wielded significant power, leading to continuous conflict. During this time, in response to the Republic's instability and failure to modernize, a group of intellectuals from Peking University promoted a new form of progressive thought called the New Culture Movement. It aimed to leave Confucian ideals in the past and make Chinese society more egalitarian and democratic. Founded in 1915, The New Youth was an influential magazine that became the primary platform for New Culture Movement intellectuals to disseminate their ideas. It published essays, critiques, and literary works advocating for reform and modernization. It became popular with the urban middle class and young intellectuals, but never resonated with the majority of the Chinese population who remained rural and were more concerned with their daily routine. Marriages became less bound by duty and roles, and the concept of family and filial piety was criticized. Women began taking work positions alongside other men. Though these trends grew, tradition still remained the status quo for even most of the urban middle class. The New Culture Movement also borrowed heavily from Western art, with artists and writers making work depicting the ever-changing culture and embracing it. From this came further cultural and political change. This began on May 4, 1919, with student protests in Tiananmen Square in Beijing against the Treaty of Versailles, which awarded the German-held territories in China to Japan, rather than to China. The May 4th movement marked a national awakening and turning point in Chinese history, as the New Culture Movement soon split, with some shifting their focus from cultural and intellectual reform to more immediate political and nationalistic goals. Power was still decentralized after Yuan Shikai's death, but in the vacuum, Sun Yat-sen returned from Japan, seeking to unify the country and continue the revolutionary cause. As the imperialist powers didn't want to see China become unified against them, the KMT had to seek out assistance from the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, was founded in July 1921 in Shanghai, influenced by the success of the Russian Revolution and Marxist-Leninist ideology. The CCP initially faced significant challenges, operating underground and struggling to gain mass support. At the urging of Comintern agents, the CCP sought out an alliance with the nationalists, part of Lenin's strategy. Sun Yat-sen's goals were foremost to reunite China and drive out the imperialist forces, coinciding with the CCP, so in 1923, an alliance between the two parties was made. They trained an army, and in 1926, they marched out to unify China and end the rule of the warlords. This was known as the Northern Expedition. Sun Yat-sen had died in 1925 but was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek. He was much more hostile to leftists, and in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched a purge against the communists in Shanghai, leading to a civil war between the KMT and the CCP. Many fled into the city. Some, like a young Mao Zedong, fled to the hills. The CCP attempted to stage uprisings, including the Autumn Harvest Uprising led by Mao, but these were largely unsuccessful. The CCP retreated to rural areas to reorganize and build support. Mao believed if a socialist revolution was to come to China, as it had in Russia, it needed to be based more on the peasantry and farmers than on the factory workers. A revolution from the country, not the city. Mao himself was from the countryside and attempted to organize rural villages for revolution during the Northern Expedition. By 1928, the KMT had successfully unified most of China, establishing a government at Nanjing, marking the beginning of the Nanjing Decade. Chiang Kai-shek then aimed to crush the CCP for good. He drove most party leaders out of Shanghai by 1931 as they fled to join Mao in his rural base. The CCP stronghold was established in southeastern China, the Jiangxi Soviet. It implemented land reforms and built a base of support among the peasantry. The KMT initiated a series of encirclement campaigns, but were repeatedly repelled by the CCP. On the fifth campaign, the nationalists changed tactics, aiming to wear down the communists, advancing and fortifying with blockhouses, slowly tightening their position. But in the face of defeat, the CCP embarked on the Long March, a strategic retreat from the Jiangxi Soviet, to travel to Yangon in Shanxi province. They trekked on foot for over 9,000 kilometers, or 5,600 miles, traversing some of China's most challenging terrain, including mountains, swamps, and rivers, which caused many deaths due to harsh environmental conditions and disease. Out of the up to 100,000 who began the journey, including Mao's Red Army, support personnel, and their families, the CCP arrived at their destination, with only 7,000 to 8,000 remaining. Surely, it seemed the CCP was all but squashed. Despite the heavy losses, the successful completion of the Long March became a symbol of the resilience and determination of the communist forces. The arduous journey solidified Mao's leadership within the CCP, and it served as a powerful propaganda tool, inspiring future recruits and consolidating the party's base. But Chiang Kai-shek still maintained governance from Nanjing. He began a program based on Sun Yat-sen's 3 stages of revolution, which first called for establishing control and eliminating warlordism. After that, there was to be a period of what he called political tutelage. Political tutelage was to be an intermediary point between authoritarianism and democracy, where the populace was to be educated to create the necessary conditions suitable for a Western-style government. The last phase was implementing full democratic governance based on a constitutional framework. But under political tutelage, the KMT government pursued a centralized, authoritarian form of governance, suppressing free expression, opposition, and dissent, as the communists were still seen as a threat. Despite the lack of freedoms, there was still progress. The government focused on modernizing infrastructure, including railways, roads, and public works, to support economic development. In 1934, Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Sung Mai-ling, launched the New Life movement, aimed to promote Confucian values, social discipline, and moral improvement. It sought to counter both the influence of Western individualism and communism, offering the best from East and West. But this program met with failure, as traditional Confucianism failed to meet anyone's needs during this time. Chiang became too Western for the common man, and too authoritarian for the urban middle classes. Soon after, by the 1930s, and in the wake of global economic distress from the Great Depression, Chiang Kai-shek had to deal with an even more pressing problem coming from the East. The new Empire of Japan was thriving with its modernization efforts under Emperor Meiji and the Meiji Constitution. Once he died, Japan entered the Taishō period, named after Emperor Taishō, who reigned from 1912 to 1926. The Taishō period saw a shift towards a more parliamentary style of government. The Diet, Japan's bicameral legislature, gained greater influence over national policy, and political parties played a more prominent role in governance. The power of the Prime Minister and the cabinet increased relative to the emperor. In 1918, Hara Takashi, leader of the Seiyukai Party, became Prime Minister, marking the first time a commoner and Christian held the position. But his moderate positions put him in the crosshairs of ultranationalists, and he was assassinated in 1921 by a railroad worker. One of the reasons for a rise in Japanese nationalism was their treatment at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. Japan proposed an amendment to the Covenant of the League of Nations that would affirm the principle of racial equality. This proposal was motivated by Japan's desire for equal treatment on the world stage and to counteract racial discrimination against Japanese nationals abroad. Despite a majority of nations voting in favor, including France and Italy, Woodrow Wilson rejected the proposal, as it was strongly opposed by the United States and the British Dominions, where racial equality would thwart the status quo. Back at home, public opinion of America had soured, as the Japanese, having modeled themselves after the West, realized they would never be viewed as equals. The Japanese were later forced to return territory on the Shandong province back to China, an important region they took from the Germans during the war. The move further escalated nationalist sentiment. In September 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake struck the Tokyo and Yokohama areas of Japan, causing widespread destruction and resulting in the deaths of approximately 140,000 people. The earthquake, with an estimated magnitude of 7.9, triggered devastating fires, landslides, and a tsunami, profoundly impacting Japanese society and infrastructure. Decades of progress had been wiped out, but the Japanese retained their unity and determination. They would rebuild. In 1925, the general election law was enacted, granting universal male suffrage to all men aged 25 and older, significantly expanding the electorate. This reform marked a major step towards democratization, although women were still excluded from voting. Japanese culture became a hodgepodge of creativity from all ideological spheres. The I-novel, or shishosetsu, was a genre of Japanese literature with an autobiographical nature and introspective style. This genre often blurred the line between fiction and reality, as authors drew heavily from their own personal experiences, emotions, and inner lives to craft their narratives. Often considered the master of the I-novel, Shige Naoya's works, such as At Kinosaki and A Dark Night's Passing, are seminal examples of the genre. Japan experienced an economic boom after World War I, benefiting from increased industrial production and exports rivaling Western powers who had been at the forefront for over 100 years. One of the main drivers of this economic success was the financial clique, or zaibatsu. The zaibatsu refers to family-controlled corporate conglomerates that dominated the Japanese economy from the Meiji period. Zaibatsu conglomerates spanned multiple industries, like banking, manufacturing, mining, shipping, and trade. This diversification helped them mitigate risks and capitalize on various economic opportunities. Some major zaibatsu included Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Yasuda. The zaibatsu wielded considerable political power, influencing government policies and decisions. Their leaders often held key positions in government advisory councils and other influential bodies. As banking and industry boomed, more peasants left the countryside to move to the cities for work, leading to a surge in the urban poor. During the 1920s, Japan's foreign policy has been dubbed Shidahara diplomacy, an approach primarily associated with Foreign Minister Shidahara Kijuro. Shidehara's diplomacy was based on a commitment to international cooperation, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and adherence to international agreements. Shidehara supported Japan's participation in the Washington Naval Conference, which aimed to prevent naval arms races and promote stability in the Pacific region. The conference resulted in the Five-Power Treaty, which limited naval capacities among major powers, including Japan. In 1928, Japan signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which condemned war as a means of resolving international disputes and promoted peaceful diplomacy. Though Shidehara diplomacy maintained peace, it faced significant opposition from militarists and nationalists within Japan, who favored a more aggressive and expansionist foreign policy. Industrialists, who had profited from Japan's imperialism, depended on the raw materials and resources found abroad. These groups criticized Shidehara's diplomacy as weak and detrimental to Japan's national interests. The Taishō era ended with the death of Emperor Taishō in 1926 and the subsequent rise of Hirohito, or Emperor Showa, marking the beginning of the Showa period. With the onset of the Great Depression, Japan's more moderate policies had fallen by the wayside, leading to the decline of support for Shidehara's diplomatic approach. Ultranationalists, industrialists, and military officers took the reins, advocating for a break with the United States and Britain, and more aggressive expansionism. Taishō democracy, instead of a stepping stone towards liberalism, was fleeting, as its fragile democratic gains were quickly undone by the resurgence of authoritarian and militaristic forces. The final stop on our global journey this episode will be Latin America, where nationalism took a slightly different form. Latin America was mostly free of colonial governance after the Wars of Independence, which you can check out here. Their economy relied mostly on agricultural exports rather than industry. In the vast pastures of Argentina, cattle were raised to produce beef, while the Caribbean relied on sugarcane. Central America would come to be known for its banana production, and its nations colloquially called banana republics. During the early 1900s, the US imposed its international economic power on Latin America through what was called dollar diplomacy. This policy was particularly prominent during the administration of President William Howard Taft and continued in various forms in the 1920s. It aimed to promote American commercial interests, stabilize Latin American economies, and reduce European influence in the Western Hemisphere. During World War I, European investment dropped, and American businesses and banks increased their investments. A series of American military interventions and occupations took place in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Honduras, and Nicaragua to protect American interests and investments, and would prop up friendly local dictators like Fulgencio Batista of Cuba or Vicente Gómez of Venezuela. Collectively, these eventually became known as the Banana Wars. Similar to Asia and the Middle East, the growing influence of the US in Latin American economies and politics sparked nationalist movements that resisted American control and sought to reclaim national resources and industries. The Great Depression of the 1930s severely impacted global trade, and Latin American countries, heavily reliant on exports to the US by this point, faced significant economic hardship as American investments decreased sharply. In response to the economic and political turmoil, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy in the 1930s, which aimed to improve relations with Latin American countries through non-intervention and mutual respect. The military was recalled, and for the first time in decades, Latin America was free of American occupation. The Depression forced Latin American governments to diversify their industry. At the turn of the century, Argentina experienced significant economic growth driven by agricultural exports, particularly beef and wheat. Foreign investment, mainly from Britain, played a crucial role in developing infrastructure such as railways and ports. The country enjoyed relative political stability under the oligarchic rule of the conservative National Autonomist Party, which dominated politics through a restricted electoral system. The Radical Civic Union, or UCR, a liberal party led by Ippolito Yrigoyen, emerged as a significant force advocating for democratic reforms and greater political participation. The Sáenz Peña Law of 1912 introduced universal male suffrage and the secret ballot, and the result was the UCR's electoral victory in 1916. Yrigoyen became the first popularly elected president. Yrigoyen's first term saw efforts to address social inequalities and improve working conditions, though his reforms were limited by resistance from conservatives and large landowners. The Great Depression severely affected Argentina's export-driven economy, leading to economic hardship and social unrest. In 1930, during his second term, Yrigoyen was overthrown in a military coup, led by General José Félix Uriburu and the nationalistas. This coup marked the end of the era of political reform and the beginning of a period of conservative military regime, the start of the infamous decade. From 1930 to 1943, Argentina was marred by political instability, electoral fraud, economic difficulties, and social unrest. The instability ended with yet another military coup on June 4, 1943, led by the United Officers Group, a nationalist faction within the military. Among the coup leaders was Colonel Juan Domingo Perón, who soon rose to power as a left-wing populist. Perón's ascent to power marked the end of the conservative era and the beginning of a new political movement focused on labor rights and social justice. Just to the north was Brazil. The Brazilian Empire had dissolved with the deposition of Emperor Pedro II after a reign of 58 years. This led to the creation of the Old Republic, Brazil's first republican government. Though nominally it was a constitutional democracy, power was centralized in the hands of local coronels, powerful landowners, and political influencers. The state became an oligarchic republic, dominated by the coffee-growing elites of São Paulo and the dairy farmers of Minas Gerais, known as the coffee with milk politics. The economy was heavily dependent on coffee exports, which accounted for a significant portion of Brazil's revenue. The rubber industry, based in the Amazon basin, declined sharply due to competition from Southeast Asian rubber plantations, which were more efficient and cost-effective, while World War I disrupted coffee exports, prompting Brazil to diversify its economy as well. Industrialization began to take root, particularly in textiles and manufacturing. Urbanization and the growth of the working class led to increased social tensions and demands for labor rights. A political and economic crisis led to the Revolution of 1930, which resulted in the overthrow of President Washington Luiz. Getúlio Vargas, a populist leader and lawyer, emerged as the new president. The Vargas era lasted over 15 years. This was Brazil's second republic. During this time, Vargas implemented significant social and economic reforms, including labor laws, social welfare programs, and efforts to industrialize the economy, aiming to modernize Brazil and reduce its dependence on coffee exports. A new constitution was adopted in 1934, and Vargas maintained his power by balancing various political factions, while suppressing both radical left and right-wing groups. In 1937, in the face of growing communist movements and the instability caused by the Great Depression, Vargas staged a coup on his own government, extended his term, and established the Estado Novo, or Third Brazilian Republic, a dictatorial regime. He dissolved the Congress, suspended the constitution, and ruled by decree. This authoritarian government suppressed political opposition, censored the media, and used propaganda to maintain control. Amid growing demands for democratic reforms, Vargas was forced to resign in 1945, leading to the Fourth Brazilian Republic and the re-establishment of democratic governance and elections. Over in Mexico, we had gone over the Porfiriato and Mexican Revolution in a previous episode of this mega-documentary. By the 1920s, the center-left Laborist Party began to consolidate power under Álvaro Obregón and later Plutarco Elias Calles, who who played crucial roles in stabilizing the country and implementing constitutional reforms. A violent conflict, the Cristero War, erupted in 1926 between the Mexican government and Catholic insurgents opposed to the secularization policies of the Calles government, which aimed to minimize church influence in public life. The rebels, known as Cristeros, were predominantly peasants and devout Catholics who took up arms to defend their religious rights. The government responded with brutal repression, including mass executions and the destruction of villages suspected of supporting the Cristeros. In total, around 100,000 perished, not including civilians. Among the deceased was former President Obregón, who had been re-elected to take office by the end of the year, but was seen as a continuation of Calles' secularization policies. It ended with a mediated agreement that eased some of the restrictions on the church, but left enduring tensions. Several Cristero leaders were later canonized by the Catholic Church for defending their freedom of religion. In 1929, after Obregón was assassinated, Calles founded the National Revolutionary Party, or PNR, a centrist catch-all party, which would dominate Mexican politics for decades. In 1934, General Cárdenas was elected president and began one of the most transformative periods in modern Mexican history, championing labor rights, better wages and working conditions, and the right to strike. He redistributed 44 million acres of land to the peasantry, establishing ejidos, communal land holdings. This reform aimed to address the deep-rooted issues of land inequality and rural poverty. By 1938, Cárdenas nationalized the oil industry, expropriating foreign British and American oil companies. This move was in response to the companies refusing to comply with Mexican labor laws. President Roosevelt honored his good neighbor policy and did not intervene, although American oil companies were eventually compensated. The nationalization led to the creation of Pemex, a state-owned oil company. This move was highly popular among Mexicans and is considered a milestone in asserting national sovereignty over natural resources. Cárdenas also nationalized the railroads, another key industry, to improve infrastructure and reduce foreign control over critical national assets. Cultural initiatives that celebrated Mexico's indigenous heritage were also supported, fostering a sense of national identity and pride. Cárdenas reorganized the PNR into the Party of the Mexican Revolution, later to be renamed the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Latin American culture and art from the early 1900s until the 1930s was marked by a dynamic interplay of indigenous traditions, European influences, and modernist innovations. This period saw the rise of cultural movements like indigenismo and muralism. Indigenismo helped revive interest in and respect for indigenous cultures and traditions, contributing to a richer and more inclusive national identity in many Latin American countries. Muralism aimed to create accessible public art that conveyed social and political messages, often with a focus on revolutionary themes and the struggles of the working class. Large-scale murals adorned public buildings and depicted scenes from Mexican history, indigenous culture, and social struggles. As nationalism and socialism grew as a response to imperialism, we will head back to Europe, where the seeds of discontent and unresolved tensions quietly took root. Next episode, the finale of our mega-documentary, World War II.